Hi, I'm Martha McGill, designer of Witch Hunt 1649. I'm just going to say a little about the process of creating a game and what I like about the end result. So firstly, what inspired the concept of Witch Hunt 1649? I really like games as a teaching tool. I think they're engaging, I think they're memorable, and I think also they encourage players to look at the past from a different vantage point. Taking on the role of someone from a 17th century community forces you to think about the kinds of challenges that they were facing in their daily life, the kind of cultural backdrop that was feeding into their beliefs and their perceptions of what was going on around them. It's a perspective that you might not necessarily get simply from reading a history book, say. When it comes to the topic of witch hunting specifically, it's a perennially popular subject. There exist games on it already, but they are not generally very historically serious. They're often sensationalised, trivialised. Sometimes you have to do things like find the real witch in the group, which is sort of problematic from a historical perspective for all kinds of reasons. So I wanted to produce a game that was a bit more academic in character, a game that would be fun, but would also encourage serious reflection on the topic, encourage a deeper understanding of the historical context and of what actually happened during witchcraft accusations, witchcraft trials, and also encourage empathy for the victims of witch hunting and a sort of better understanding of their stories. So how did I incorporate research into the game, and did it lead to any new research? Yes, not necessarily in areas I'd expected. So I'm a historian of early modern supernatural beliefs, particularly in Britain. I'd worked on the Scottish witch hunts and I drew on some of the research that I'd done and on my knowledge of the primary source material. But I found I didn't know nearly enough about the nuts and bolts of how people actually lived in this period. Things like, what did people have in their houses? Or what was the price of a plough relative to a sieve, relative to a basket for carrying your fish around? These things turned into little mini research projects. There's a real shortage of household inventories for Scotland from this period. We're also relatively short on material about clothing. So things like getting artwork for cards right was again quite time consuming in research terms. Thinking about the fate cards for the game, which give players little scenarios to grapple with, involved some going back into church records, Kirk session records, which recorded why people were getting in trouble with the local church and the sorts of challenges that they were facing day to day. I also personally had to really get familiar with the nitty-gritty of trials, how they worked, how local trials worked relative to central trials, how they worked differently at different points in the period. Not all of this actually made it into the final version of the game, but more of it is laid out in the associated curriculum guide. There's a model there for doing a roleplay of a trial for players who do want to delve a little more deeply into that area. I have a favourite element in the game. The thing that I enjoy most, both playing the game and supervising students playing the game, is the kind of group dynamics that emerge over the course of a playthrough. Players are paired, so they are competing with other players at the table, but they have an ally. And I think this makes for some really interesting sorts of tensions, disputes. Some players are very, very collaborative and really get into the teamwork side of things, really play as sort of supports to their allies. Other players can be a little bit more individualistic and a little bit more inclined to do things like hoard resources, try and win by themselves. And some players are much more eager than others to go after other players at the table. And I think it's quite fun. It means that characters develop, often around the character cards that players have. These little drawings on this card take on a real individual personality and characteristics according to how the player is representing them. And it makes for sort of fun squabbles. There's the potential almost for betrayals when it comes to whether you support or renounce an ally during a witch trial. And then there's the potential for lovely moments of kind of saving the lives of allies by using an ability at the crucial moment to help them out or something like that. So I think it's a fun social experience from that perspective, as well as perhaps offering some sort of insight into how community dynamics can develop, how relationships can either be solidified or really fracture under pressure. What do I hope players take away from this game? I hope players enjoy playing the game. I hope it's a fun social experience, but I hope it also inspires some serious reflection. I mean, witch hunts varied widely. Scotland in 1649 is one example of a witch hunt. It is not the archetype, but I hope the game gives some sense of the community dynamics that might underpin witch hunting, perhaps the kinds of challenges people might be facing to subsistence, or the sorts of accusations that were lodged against supposed witches. More generally, I'd like players to take away the sense that witch hunting was not something perpetrated by monsters. It was something done by normal community members. They weren't necessarily ignorant, backwards, primitive, mired in superstition. They weren't necessarily spiteful, vindictive, accusing witches because they hated women or because they wanted to attack anybody who was different. For the most part, the people who accused others of witchcraft and the authorities who then guided cases through the court system were broadly well-meaning. They believed in witchcraft because they had this cultural scaffolding that meant it made sense to believe in witchcraft, this theological, natural philosophical framing that justified it. And they believed genuinely that hunting witches was the best way to safeguard their community against the machinations of the devil. So I'd like the game to give a sense of the ways in which witch hunting could be weird. The accusations involved fantastical elements, certainly, but it's also a sort of normal and mundane story about how perfectly nice neighbours can end up turning against each other. And I think that has all kinds of important resonances for modern day society as well. How do games uniquely allow us to engage with history compared with other media? I think games typically encourage this real micro-historical perspective where you step into the shoes of a particular individual. They may or may not be a real person, but you're going through the day-to-day processes of somebody from the past, and it forces this other perspective on you. You have to really think about the challenges and the concerns of individuals in a way that you might not when you're reading big overviews about themes and patterns set out in history books. So I think games can be really great for encouraging empathy, encouraging a different kind of engagement with stories from the past, and just promoting that understanding of what day-to-day life was like.